Hi, this is Skyler with Regan. We're just going to do a brief update on today's inflation numbers, as this is the one number that's to come out before next week's Fed meeting. So if we look at, this is ECO on Bloomberg, we look at the headline numbers of 0.2% actual versus an estimate and 2.5% year over year. I want to get into this because it's actually really confusing. Okay, so if I click on month over month, what that's going to do is going to pull up my monthly inflation number. And there's one thing to point out here, that's seasonally adjusted. And so there are metrics out there in at the BLS and at the Fed where they're actually seasonally adjusting these numbers based on what month they're coming out. But if I go back and I look at year over year, so we talk about these in the same breath. That's actually not seasonally adjusted. And so this is really cool. They break down services versus goods. You can see we peaked at 9. Today we're at about 2.53 year over year. Awesome. Okay. And so getting over to here, what's really confusing here is you have the seasonally adjusted number. You could see just by eyeballing it, it's about 0.2% per month. But then non-seasonally adjusted, we've seen almost no inflation here over the last 3 months. But we saw really heavy inflation in the first half of the year. Okay. So let's pull up this spreadsheet that and I pointed this out yesterday, but what was really interesting to me was tips on the front end. January tips here are yielding about 5.2. A couple days ago, they were yielding 5.4. And then also break evens, which are yields on tips minus yields on bonds. Okay. So the market, which is if you think inflation is going to be higher than 0.5% over the next year, you want to go out and buy tips, which will adjust to higher inflation. Okay. And you could see it down here out 2 years, it's about 1.5%. And you have very muted market expectations for inflation going all the way out to 30 years here, roughly 2%. So let's pull up some data. I update this spreadsheet for our own purposes monthly. And what I'm targeting here is the differentiation between that seasonally adjusted number and the non-seasonally adjusted number. So what is a tip? If I go back and I want to go buy these April, let's make it easier. I want to buy these April of 25 tips. What are these? They are bonds. This particular bond is paying, it matures here in April and it's paying an eighth of a percentage points. But it is moving, its principal is moving based on consumer price indices. Okay. And you could see Spernza, they call it. The Spernza index, this moves up over time. This started at 258 in April of 2020, and today it's at 314. Okay. So your principal is moving up. It's a little bit confusing, but your principal is moving up based on where inflation goes. Okay. So when I look at Spernza, this number right here, these are non-seasonally adjusted. So whereas what you hear on television or read in the newspaper, they're talking about seasonally adjusted numbers. The metric that governs what tips pay out, Treasury inflation protected securities, is actually the non-seasonally adjusted number. Okay. So I break this out here. We have seasonally adjusted, which are headline, and we have non-seasonally adjusted, which is what feeds into the actual securities. So let's just focus on this number right here, which is current inflation. And on a seasonally adjusted basis, current inflation year over year is 259. And that's just based on the last 12 months. What they do is they basically add up the last 12 individual inflation prints, and that gets you to 259. Over here, the headline number just for that year over year is 253, which is not seasonally adjusted. Because over a year, if you have 12 total prints, you don't need to seasonally adjust. So you could see here, and this is what we're doing here, is we're saying, okay, if inflation is at 20 basis points a month for the next 12 months, where does this number travel to? Okay. So You could see here it starts at 259. It stays there through December, and then it retreats to a one handle and back to 2.41. Voila, basically your annualized 0.2% number. But over here, and again, this is what feeds into Spernza and what the headline number is for year over year. If inflation's at 0.2, we actually get up to 3.45% by the end of the year. And then we drop back down towards basically the same. They even out. So when we investigate month by month, what are my non-seasonally adjusted numbers and why these differentiate, okay? What happens in the fall versus the rest of the year? Here we go. We just reported August at about a 0.2, which actually is more than average inflation for Augusts going back to, we go back to 2014 here, about 10 years. But then as we hit winter here, those numbers get down to actually negative. Inflation historically is negative in November and December. And then here's your seasonally adjusted numbers over here. And then we break it down by quarter. Those seasonally adjusted numbers average out to about a quarter per quarter. Whereas here, we should expect to see actually negative inflation if the past repeats itself. That's part of the reason why when you go into tips here, it's part of the reason why these January tips are relatively cheap. Okay. They're about 40 basis points, 45 basis points cheap to these 4 to 5 month bills. So that's just a breakdown. We like to look at these just to think about, well, what is the market expecting? What does history expect? And what should we expect to see if, for example, we see 0.2% for the next 4 to 5 months? Inflation should rear its head back to 3 handle, and the market's going to get worried. Okay. And this is what's reported. This is the number that matters, that 2.5% that came out today, or the 2.53. So if inflation does come back to 0.2, we're going to see 350. Even if it's at 0.1% per month for the next 4 months, we're going to see 3.04% by December. And that's what might mute the Fed lowering rates 4 times this year and the predicted 9 times over the next 12 months. Thank you for your time.